Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 5th of January, where we are talking about the next 3 chapters in the textbook: organizing and outlining, beginning and ending, and wording speeches. Last class, we talked a little bit about Toastmasters, that international organization that helps individuals develop their public speaking skills. And we also talked a little bit about some of the opening chapters in the textbook and some of the language associated with the discipline. For the attendance question for last class, I had asked you to consider ways to control nerves. Again, you don't want to eliminate nerves entirely because they can be quite useful to help you put effort into a performance, which is basically what delivering a speech is a performance. So oftentimes public speaking classes are taught by theater teachers for this very reason. But also, public speaking classes are taught by English teachers because ultimately putting together a speech follows many of the same criteria as putting together a paper. The difference, of course, is rather than writing, you are speaking, so you are presenting to your audience. And in terms of trying to control nerves, there are lots of different ways and techniques that you can utilize. Some of the techniques that were discussed in the textbook, which I also recommend, are deep breathing, because ultimately, during times of anxiety, you're likely not to breathe very deeply. In fact, I remember taking years ago a woman's self defense class, and we were told that in the event of an attack, we should yell out the word no. And I had assumed, as did my classmates, that this was to draw attention to ourselves. That was secondary. The primary reason was to force oxygen into our lungs when we would need to either fight or flight or have flight in that situation, fight or flee. So I always remember that, and that during times of anxiety, you're likely to hold your breath. In fact, it's one of the things that I oftentimes find with filler words, words like and ah, that what individuals are doing is that they are using those words to try to get oxygen into them. So I'm a big proponent of breathing in very deeply and also taking pauses during your speech, which allows you time to breathe. Much better to take a silent pause than to use an or an ah to get oxygen. Being well prepared is probably one of the best things you can do to alleviate anxiety. So the better you know the material, the more likely it is that you aren't going to feel anxiousness. So that said, I encourage you to practice, 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 much like the Toastmasters video did. Other ways that you can reduce anxiety, certainly things like scent and sound have been found to reduce anxiety, particularly scents such as lavender and sounds such as classical music, in fact. Now, of course, if you're not a fan of classical music or you're not a fan of lavender, then I wouldn't recommend that. But it's been found to do things like decrease heart rate and to decrease pulse rate as well. Meditation, exercise, eating or drinking. And that said, you need to know your body and how your body is going to respond. So I always suggest that, if you've heard that you need to have a large meal in the morning right before speech is not necessarily the time to try that because your body might rebel against such a thing. So, but staying well hydrated and making sure that you're comfortable. And I always suggest that you don't wear something that's new. The reason why is because you just don't know how that outfit is going to feel after you've had it on for a while. That said, you want to dress appropriately for your audience and you want to dress respectfully. But you certainly don't want to have your attention wander with thinking about things like your outfit. And I know sometimes people feel a little self-conscious because of some of the physical symptoms that they might experience with nerves, such as blushing. And again, you might want to think about the colors that you're wearing or the kinds of outfits that you're wearing so that ultimately you can reduce that or at the very least reduce your anxiety about it. So I know that I personally, when I tend to get very engaged in a topic, my chest and my neck will oftentimes get red. I found that wearing a turtleneck makes me feel much more comfortable, because regardless of what kind of physical symptoms I might be experiencing, that's not necessarily visible to outsiders. So again, I'm sure that you all have your own techniques. I'm looking forward to reading your responses. I read and responded to all of your first responses of your introductory responses in the discussion forum. So, welcome all to the class. And as you know, your autobiographical speech is a way for you to expand and develop on what you began to do in the discussion forum questions, which was to tell us a little bit about yourself. And you've got 5 minutes in which to do that. And the idea is that you're close to the 5 minute mark. Certainly, you're not going to be timed to the second. But, you figure that the longer the speech, the more leeway you have. So certainly with a 5 minute speech, you don't want to go 5 minutes over. That would be double the time. I'm thinking perhaps 30 seconds on either end for a 5 minute speech. Now, if you were giving an hour speech and going 5 minutes over, then that wouldn't necessarily be that terrible of a thing. But again, that's one of the tasks that you have when you are delivering to an audience is the timing. So you want to be in the area of about 5 minutes. You're not being asked to use outside resources, and you're not being asked to use any kind of audios or visuals. That said, you certainly are free to, but those are elements that we will be incorporating later on in the semester. And as we are thinking about how to proceed with our speech, I wanted to specifically talk about organizing and outlining, because your outline will probably be your best friend when it comes to delivering your speech. And unlike the written outline that you probably are accustomed to for English classes, for instance, you don't want to be too detailed. The idea is that less is more. The outline should have just keywords and phrases so that ultimately, if you needed to refer to it, then you would be easily able to skim it. And what that means is that you can maintain eye contact with your camera or with your audience. That said, I think I had indicated last class that I literally use the notes that I post below the class videos as my outline, as my speaking outline, so I can briefly look down like so and make sure that I'm on target. I liken the outline to something like a trapeze artist might use during a performance, that it would be silly for a trapeze artist not to use a net, because ultimately you could get hurt if you were to fall. A good trapeze artist would not fall, however, but still, you don't want to take that chance. Same thing with your outline. If you've practiced enough and you've put effort into your outline, you may not even necessarily have to refer to it. And remember, the outline is for you, not for the audience, so that you can deviate from your outline. It's almost like deviating from your GPS. But understand that it comes with a little bit of risk, in that if you are deviating, then you basically aren't able to get a sense as to what might happen with timing or with content. So, one of the goals of this class is to have you experiment with different kinds of outlines so that you can figure out what makes the most sense for you. As I had indicated, what I put in the notes below the video is pretty much what feels comfortable for me, where I've got major topics and then subtopics underneath. One of the things that I recommend with the outline is that you've got a lot of spacing so that it's easy to skim, and that the outline you use when you're performing is in hard copy, so that ultimately if there was any kind of mechanical failure, you at least have the hard copy in front of you. Some people like to use index cards. If you're one of those, I suggest you number the cards in the event that they were to get out of order. Some people like to just write on the fronts of a sheet of paper. Some like to write on the front and the back. Again, it's a matter of personal preference. And again, you don't necessarily have to keep to formatting standards that you would use in an academic situation, because the outline is for you. So use the size font that feels comfortable for you. Use the colors that seem comfortable for you. Things of that nature. Some of the advantages to outlining, which will require you to organize as well, is that it's easier to remember, it's easier to present, and that makes you more credible as a speaker and much more persuasive as well. So, you need to think about your thesis, what your central idea is going to be. Obviously, you're talking about your life experience, but are you going to give us a holistic view? Are you going to focus on a particular time period, perhaps a particular hobby or a particular person? Keep in mind that the speech would not be about the hobby or the person. The speech would be about how that hobby or person helps us to understand who you are. So there are lots of different ways that we could go about the autobiographical speech. And if you're struggling with finding a topic, I usually recommend talking about education because that's something that we all share. But as you know, we will have practice sessions, and you're certainly free to contact me prior to the practice session. But I will be touching base with each of you about your speech topic at the very least, and certainly anything else that could assist you with delivering your first speech. And even though you don't need to be concerned about your second or your third speech right now, we are in an intercession class. It's highly condensed. So keeping in the back of your mind the informative speech, 10 minutes, what could you teach the class about? And sometimes students like to choose the topic that they talked about in their informative or in their autobiographical speech to discuss in their informative speech. So you might have indicated in your autobiographical speech that you are a dog lover. So your informative speech might be about dogs, let's say pugs. In fact, I'm talking about myself because I'm a big pug lover. And in fact, your third speech, your persuasive speech, might be to encourage you to consider getting a pug if you are on the market for looking for a dog. And that's not to say that all three speeches have to connect with one another, but they could. So, at least thinking about possibilities for informative and persuasive speeches. But of course, the focus right now is the autobiographical speech. And the good news is that the way that you put it together will be very similar, probably, to the way that you've put together English papers in the past. You need to think about some sort of an organizational plan. And all speeches and basically all pieces of writing have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But outside of that, you basically get to decide how much or how little to devote to each of those pieces. Usually, the bulk of the paper is the body of the paper. This is where your evidence and details are. And there's lots of different ways that you can organize those pieces of evidence and details. You might want to do it chronologically. So you are talking about time order, which works very nicely if you're trying to teach your audience something, because you can talk about it in steps. First this, then that, then that. Perhaps you want to divide it into categories, topical, or even talk about order of importance, either putting the most important first, which can be very persuasive to an audience and impressive, but that also means that you are ending with the least important, so it might be a bit of a letdown. You could do it the opposite way and talk about the least important first and work your way to the most important. But again, will your audience hold on that long until you get to the most important pieces? So there isn't one best way of doing it. You could talk about causal or relationships, or talk about it from a spatial perspective or a location perspective. I oftentimes use the analogy of a real estate agent trying to sell a house. And there are lots of different ways that that real estate agent will go about presenting this piece of property. And part of it will be dependent on the property itself. And part of it will be dependent on the audience or the prospective customers. And part of it will be dependent on the actual real estate agent and their strengths as well. So let's say you were trying to sell an old house. You might want to talk about it from a chronological perspective. It was built in the 1800s and it has a rich history. Or perhaps it's a new house, new construction, so that it has never been lived in before. But I don't know if this would be the best way to talk about a house that was, let's say, 50 years old. That's not necessarily old or not necessarily new either. Perhaps you wanted to talk about that house from a topical standpoint. The three major elements of this house happen to be the neighborhood, the new roof, and the fact that it has a large backyard. you might even want to evaluate that as being more or less important, those three pieces. And that can vary based on the customers. So the neighborhood might be most important to one set of customers, while the new roof might be more important to another set of customers. Or perhaps you can talk about the house spatially, that once you walk in, immediately to your left is the living room, and immediately in front of you is a small staircase that gets to a kitchen. And to the right of that kitchen is a small bedroom that could be used as a den. And to the left of that is a dining room, and off of that dining room is a deck. Now, you've never been to this house, but I'm describing what it appears like. So again, there is no right or wrong way in terms of organizing your pieces of information. You just want to make sure that it makes sense to the listener in the way that you are connecting those pieces of information. So some suggestions. Audiences oftentimes respond well to things that are familiar. So connecting familiar things. This is oftentimes a trick that's done in education. Talking about, let's say in a mathematics class, the material you've learned previously, that which is familiar, and then connecting it to something new. Question and answer, and that audiences like to basically answer questions, even rhetorical questions that don't necessarily require or expect a response. And that said, when you work with an audience, you never know what might happen. I always remember in my early days of teaching when I asked a rhetorical question, a question I wasn't expecting a response to, in a Shakespeare class about a play called A Midsummer Night's Dream. And you may know it, and it happens to be about people falling in and out of love through magical spells. And it turns out that one of the people who falls in love, the Queen of the Fairies, she's ranked at the top of the social scale, falls in love with somebody at the bottom of the social scale. In fact, his name is Bottom. He's aptly named. And worse, he's been through magic transformed into an ass, a donkey. And the idea, of course, is that they've all been manipulated through magic, and this is why this is happening. But I know that sometimes audiences still struggle to understand how could the Queen of Fairies fall in love with a literal and figurative donkey. So my rhetorical question to the class is, well, it should try to illustrate how timeless and universal Shakespeare is. How many of you have ever fallen in love with an ass? I expected a few chuckles or nods. Instead, I got hands in the air with individuals wanting to share their stories, which was wonderful, actually, because it shows, again, how relevant Shakespeare can be to contemporary day. But you never know when you ask a question. But I think it's something that's very human, that if a question is asked, you try to supply the answer, even if you just do that internally. Problem and solution. This works very well, especially for persuasive speeches, where you want to show that there's some sort of issue that can be improved or rectified through taking the action that you are suggesting, or through changing the belief system that you are suggesting. Or even a process of elimination, so that basically you're left with one option. So again, for your speaking outline, keywords and phrases. If you find this difficult to do, you might want to write out an outline or even a paper itself, and then keep reducing it so that it's keywords and phrases. So those are just supposed to jog your memory. List stage directions. So if there's something that you wanted to do, for instance, if you wanted to show a prop, you might want to remind yourself on your outline that that would be the time to show your prop. Use note cards or paper, as I had suggested. If you're using the edition of the text that I had ordered, there is an example of an outline on page 119 about drunk drivers. And I can tell you that in terms of the examples the textbook gives, I think those examples are much too detailed for you to use as a speaking outline. As an outline as a reader, it makes perfect sense, because basically if you were to read that outline, you'd get a sense of the speech as a whole. But again, as a speaker, less is more. And your speech needs to have an outline. I won't be evaluating that speech unless you send me an outline via email, via PDF. So you can send that to me and the day in which you are uploading your speech. So we've got a little bit of time for that. But you should be thinking about it. And you should also think about the fact that not only do audience members have poor listening skills, which we talked about last class, they also have poor memory skills. How poor? Pretty poor. It's been shown that individuals can remember plus or minus 7 items. In fact, some have suggested plus or minus 3 items. Minus 3 items is 2 or 1. So that's very low indeed. Now, obviously, we can remember more than that, and we utilize lots of techniques in order to do that. Things like chunking, for instance, where you're grouping like items together. We oftentimes do that with phone numbers, where we divide phone numbers into 3 digits for the first 3 numbers, 4 digits for the next 4 numbers. So you're really thinking about 2 groups rather than 7 separate items. Or mnemonics, memory techniques or devices, things like acronyms, where the first letter of each word is supposed to stand for something. So, one of the first rules of writing, for instance, is KISS. Keep it simple, silly, though you might have heard of it as keep it simple, stupid. That's an acronym where each letter of the word KISS is supposed to represent something. Songs and jingles can work very nicely. I tend to have a notoriously poor memory, but yet I can remember a phone number, 867-5309. And some of you, if you know your pop music from the 1980s, know that this is from a pop song that was, I think, redone again in the 2000s. But nevertheless, I don't remember phone numbers, but I remember this, not only because it was set to a memorable tune, but because of repetition. Repetition really is one of the keys to learning, as I had a biology teacher who said that in high school. I may not remember much about biology, but I do remember him saying that repetition is the key to learning. So moving on to beginning and ending speeches, which in the edition of the text I had ordered, that's chapter 8. There's something called the primary recency effect, that people remember best what they hear and read first and what they see and hear last. So in other words, you want to put particular attention to the beginning and to the ending. Again, you might want to try this with your own experiences. Let's say reflecting back on an event, such as a vacation. In theory, the beginning and the ending of it should be more vivid to you than the middle of it. Again, these are what studies have shown. Studies aren't always accurate, but definitely you want to put in a little bit of effort, more so than perhaps you normally would in a beginning and an ending, because that's what's likely to be remembered by your audience. And some of the techniques that you can utilize to get your audience's attention and to help them remember. Talking about reality, that which is in our real world, tends to draw audience attention. Proximity, something that's nearby. And familiar, something that the audience is aware of. So I think about my own experiences, let's say, going through the news in the morning. And if there is a news story about education, I'm likely to stop and at least skim it, because this is something that's real to me. I'm an educator. It's close to my experiences and it's quite familiar. If it's about higher education, I'm likely to pay more attention to it. If it's about Greenfield Community College, I will read it in its entirety, regardless if I have the time or not to do so. Again, because it's directly related to me. Audiences and readers tend to like suspense and conflict. This is something that, again, news media has done very nicely. They understand that we pay attention to suspense and conflict, as well as things that are real and familiar and have proximity to us. Humor, but you need to be careful with humor, because humor can oftentimes be misunderstood or misinterpreted. We'll be talking about culture soon, and how humor is oftentimes culturally based. Just stating that something is important already leads an audience to listen a little bit more carefully. So stating its importance. Question, as I had suggested earlier, then you do want to supply an answer unless it's an obvious answer. It's a rhetorical question. Quotations can work very nicely, and beginning or ending your speech with a quotation, actually any of these techniques for beginning and or ending your speech are very effective. That said, you need to find the quotation. You want to make sure that it's an accurate quotation. And while I know that everybody wants to go on Google initially, just be careful. And we'll talk a little bit more about the internet as the semester progresses. But just because it's on the internet, it doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. You might have heard of a resource called Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, which works much like a dictionary. It lists quotations based on topic in alphabetical order, so that if you wanted to find a quote, let's say about war, you could go to the W section and find the W, and find multiple quotes about war. So I do remember one speech that I heard years ago, and the person began with a rather lengthy quote. And because the speech began with a quote, they needed to read the quote because they wanted it to be accurate. And because it was lengthy, we had assumed that the entire speech would be read, which would be deadly. It turns out it wasn't that way. Once they were done with their quote, then they shifted gears. And I always remember that I recommended to that person, if they had just told us beforehand, let me begin with a quote, then none of us would have been assuming that the rest of the speech would be read. Of course, the quote needs to be relevant to whatever it is that you're discussing. Storytelling as well. People love stories. Again, the story should be relevant. Personal references, because we are interested in the speaker, but that said, again, it needs to be relevant. A startling statement. And I think I told you last class about a speech where someone, in my opinion, was not thinking about the audience or about the situation because they were talking about being true to oneself, and they were actually beginning to disrobe so that they could show the true them. And while that wasn't very effective, I do remember a speech that I actually listened to a while back. It was during an in-person night class, and it was right after the break. So we took a break about midway through the class. This is where most people would get something to eat or drink, and I was going through my notes. And the break was almost over, and I heard someone beginning to choke, and they were at the back of the class. Time seemed to stop at that point, and I remember thinking to myself a multitude of things. I need to call 911. I have to call security. I have to get to the student. Do I remember how to perform the Heimlich maneuver? And as I'm standing up, I didn't even have a chance to leave my desk from the front of the room. Someone who was standing next to the choking, quote, victim, unquote, performed the Heimlich, and out popped from the choking victim's mouth a rolled ball of paper. It's quite surreal, and we're all staring at this paper. The person who had performed the Heimlich calmly walks to the front of the room and declares that what we had just witnessed was a simulation of a choking. But if we had indeed seen a real choking, would we know what to do? And that this person's informative speech was now about the Heimlich maneuver. It was brilliant because not only had it been very well planned that a friend of the speaker was going to pretend to choke and have a rolled ball of paper in their mouth that they could spit out, but also because they took a topic that might seem a bit dry, how to perform the Heimlich maneuver, and they made it very interesting and very important because just seconds earlier, all of us had probably been thinking the same thing. Would we have been able to perform the Heimlich maneuver? And yes, there was some risk involved. Something could have gone wrong. Perhaps someone else would have reached the, quote, choking victim, unquote, first and performed the Heimlich. And when you perform it correctly, you can actually break a rib. Or perhaps the person who was pretending to choke actually began to choke on that piece of paper. But again, it had all been planned very, very well, and it was quite effective in terms of gaining our interest. So sometimes doing something startling at the beginning or the ending of a speech, or sometimes the middle, but again, we're specifically talking about the primary recency effect and beginnings and endings. Or forecasting and summarizing. In other words, telling the audience what you're going to talk about, talking about it, and then reviewing what it was that you talked about. So, language, that's the last chapter that I had assigned for today, wording your speech. And as a speaker, we're focusing on the oral style, not the written style. So the oral style is conversational. In other words, it's as if you're having a conversation with someone. You're using simpler vocabulary, shorter sentences, and it's much less formal than what you would do with writing. So, some things to consider in terms of language, knowing that, again, you want to keep the sense of conversationality and informality. That there are denotations to words, those are dictionary definitions, and I don't believe this is covered in the textbook. But there are also connotations and associations with words, and you want to be careful because sometimes a word can have, or two words can have, a similar denotation or dictionary definition, but very different connotations or associations. Take the words cheap and frugal, for instance. Both of them mean that you're not spending much money. But cheap is viewed much more negatively than frugal, which is viewed as much more positively. In other words, frugal has a much more positive connotation than cheap does, even though they both have the same denotation. So, at least thinking about the kind of language that you're using and the kinds of associations of the words. And in terms of definitions, you don't necessarily just have to define what a word is. You can define what a word is not. That's a negative definition. So, for instance, if I were going to give a speech about wealth, I might say wealth is not financial security, but it's health and happiness. So instead, I've told you what wealth is not, and I've given it a new definition. And of course, definitions are influenced by context, the situation. So think about if I were talking about the word brief. If I were mentioning that in an English class, I'm probably talking about being concise. But if I were talking about that in a fashion class, I'm probably talking about an article of clothing, a brief. And if I was talking about that in a law class, I'm probably talking about a legal report. So again, the context can influence how a word is understood. So, some advanced techniques with language, and again, this is something that you can work on through a lifetime. I think about some of the great speeches, and in fact, we usually talk about speeches such as the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King, which is oftentimes evaluated by public speakers as perhaps the best speech that was ever given, where they seem almost inspired. And certainly, while we could try to aspire to something like that, that's not the level that we have to maintain. We just want to be clear and we want to be competent. But when you think about some of the great speakers, they oftentimes utilize things like imagery. And imagery is very helpful because it helps the audience visualize. And think about how advertisements oftentimes do this. They appeal to your senses, your sense of sight or taste or smell or touch. It's one of the reasons why after a commercial about a beverage, for instance, we might be thirsty because they're talking about the thirst quenching beverage and we can actually hear the ice pop, and so to speak. Metaphors, and this is when you are comparing two dissimilar things, and you're not using the words like or as. If you're using the words like or as, then that's a simile. So you could say cold as ice, that's a simile. But if you wanted to have a metaphor and say that I am ice, then basically you're not using like or as, you're making a direct connection. I remember listening to a sample student speech, actually, where a metaphor was used, an autobiographical speech, where the speaker was saying that they were red. I am red. And they weren't saying they were like red. They were saying that they were literally the color red. I am red. And what they were doing is they were drawing comparisons between their own personality with associations with the color red. Passion, for instance, and quick temper, for instance. And that worked very nicely, and it was quite creative. The difficulty was that as the speech progressed, they began doing what I call tap dancing, trying to make these really tenuous connections that weren't necessarily that obvious. At one point, they were talking about the car battery portals, and it became a little bit confusing. So that said, you want to be careful when you're using a metaphor or simile that you're not losing control of it. Rhyme, words that end with similar sounds. And alliteration, words that begin with similar sounds. And these are many literary techniques that you'll see in, for instance, poetry, or even in something like a short story or a drama. And again, they're very advanced techniques, so you don't necessarily have to be compelled to be utilizing these. But when we think about the great speakers of our time, usually they're using literary techniques as well as communicating their message. So your language should be audience-centered. In other words, appropriate for the audience. So you want to make sure that you are gearing your speech to a general audience, because that's what we are. So even though there might be individuals in your audience who have a certain level of expertise, perhaps there's several nursing majors in our audience, you don't want to use terms that are too medical or too technical, because the assumption is that the average person should be able to understand your speech. Again, thinking about things like age. And of course, we're talking with a group of adults. So that means that we have liberties that we wouldn't necessarily have with, let's say, a general audience. or making things appropriate to particular audience members. So, for instance, there might be some topics that might be seen as being very gender specific. Let's say something like breast cancer. Though, of course, both men and women can suffer from breast cancer, but usually we associate breast cancer with women, and that's my phone. So please ignore some of the hazards from working from home. But at any rate, when we're talking a little bit about the idea of breast cancer, in this particular instance, you wouldn't necessarily have to just talk about the fact that breast cancer is something that both men and women experience, but you could also talk about that although women tend to experience breast cancer more so than men, ultimately there are probably men who have women in their lives, so therefore it would be something that would be relevant to them as well. And you also want to try to use gender neutral terms whenever possible, and culturally sensitive terms whenever possible in your language. You want to try to be as inclusive as possible. That said, you don't want to be so afraid to talk that you don't want to say anything at all. So, better to perhaps make a small error and maybe not even draw someone's attention to it than to worry so much about making a mistake. For instance, if I had indicated that for today's class on Tuesday, obviously today isn't Tuesday, but if I just let that error go, you would just assume that I made a small mistake. But if I try to correct it and then continue to make mistakes by giving you multiple days of the week, then you would begin to pay very close attention to the fact that I'm not quite sure what day it is. So thinking about things like pronouns, when in doubt, try to use plurals because that helps to eliminate bias that could be associated with he or she. But again, the whole point of language is to communicate. And I know that certainly I speak much more informally than I write. When I'm writing, I talk about the postal carrier, but when I'm speaking, I might talk about the mailman, which is particularly problematic because the person who delivers the mail is female. But again, old habits die hard. I certainly don't mean to offend when I ask about the mailman. So try to be aware and say postal carrier if at all possible, or whatever the situation may be. But understand that the main goal of speaking is to be able to communicate with your audience. So those were some things that I wanted you to consider in terms of your in terms of your first speech. But of course, all speeches, and that includes the second and the third and any other speeches you might be making. So what's left is our attendance question, which will be due on our class discussion forum on Friday, which is the 6th at 9 a.m. And again, if you need additional time, please let me know. What do you think your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 will be, and why? What do you think your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 will be, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about, public speaking. Take care. Bye-bye.